The home was quiet, the darkness enveloping every corner as Charlotte tiptoed down the hall toward her nephew Zachary's room. Her heart raged, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She knew this was wrong, but the thought of what she was about to do only heightened her desire. The magnetic pull that had developed between them was undeniable. Every glance and inadvertent touch had intensified the unbearable tension, and tonight she was determined to surrender to it. She gently pushed the door open, holding Charlotte's gaze lingered on him, her pulse quickening as she took in every detail. The strong lines of his shoulders, the way his shirt clung to his chest, and the faint hint of stubble along his jaw. She bit her lip, resisting the impulse to pull away, yet a deeper, primal force held her firmly in place. Her eyes traveled down his body, following the shape of him beneath the sheets, and a rush of heat flooded her. She wasn't turning back now. Quietly, she slipped inside Zachary. She breathed softly, her voice low and seductive. He stirred slightly, his head turning in her direction, but he didn't wake. Charlotte's heart sounded wildly. The thrill of seeing him like this, completely unaware of what she was doing, sent a shiver down her spine. She lowered herself further, her lips hovering just inches from his cheek, and pressed a feather-like kiss to his skin. He murmured softly in his sleep, his lips parting as if responding to her touch, and Charlotte's breath hitched. Slowly, she trailed her lips along his jaw, her kisses growing bolder as she moved down to his neck. The feel of his warm skin beneath her mouth and the faint scent of him made her head spin. She couldn't resist sliding her hand up his chest, her fingers teasingly tracing the contours of his muscles. He shifted beneath her, his brow furrowing slightly, but still he didn't wake, encouraged. Leo leaned closer, her body pressing lightly against his as she kissed the side of his neck, her tongue flicking out to taste him. The sensation made him shudder, his breathing hitching, and she smiled against his skin. "Zachary," she whispered again, her voice a sultry murmur. "Wake up." His eyes fluttered open slowly, still glazed with sleep, and he blinked up at her, confusion flickering in his gaze as he tried to process what was happening. "On, Charlotte," he murmured, his voice thick and groggy. "What are you?" But before he could finish, she silenced him with a kiss, soft and tender at first, then deeper, more intense and more demanding. Zachary stiffened, his eyes widening in shock, but Charlotte didn't pull away. She could feel the way his body responded to her, and could sense the way his hesitation melted away as his lips began to move against hers. She whispered, interrupting the kiss just long enough to murmur against his mouth, "Please, just this once, allow me." Zachary let out a low, helpless groan, his hands coming up to grip her waist as if he couldn't help himself. Charlotte interpreted this as a signal to intensify her kiss, releasing every ounce of suppressed desire into the kiss. His resistance crumbled, and suddenly his hands were everywhere, sliding up her back, tangling in her hair, pulling her closer as he kissed her back with a hunger that matched her own. Charlotte's heart raced as she felt him shift beneath her, his body arching up to meet hers. The feel of him firm and hot beneath her made her gasp softly, and she couldn't stop herself from grinding against him. Her movements are slow and sensual. Zachary's grip tightened on her hips. A desperate sound escaped his throat as he buried his face in her neck, his breath coming out in harsh, ragged gasps. "Aunt Charlotte, we shouldn't." He murmured, his voice strained, but his words were lost as she kissed him again. Her tongue slipping past his lips to tangle with his, he groaned, his hands sliding down to her thighs, and Charlotte shivered as his touch sent jolts of electricity through her. "Don't think," she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. "Just feel." And then she kissed him again, her hands roaming over his body as if trying to memorize every inch of him. She felt him shudder beneath her, felt the way his body responded to her touch, and it only made her bolder. Slowly she slid her hand beneath his shirt, her fingers trailing over his bare skin, and Zachary let out a low, helpless moan. Charlotte breathed, his voice a strained whisper, but he didn't push her away. Instead, his hands moved over her body, exploring her curves, his touch hesitant at first, then growing more confident as he realized she wasn't going to stop him. Charlotte arched against him, her breath coming out in soft, breathless gasps as his hands slid up her sides, his fingers brushing lightly over her ribs. The feel of him, the way he touched her, made her head spin. She leaned down, her lips trailing over his collarbone, her tongue flicking out to taste him. Zachary's hands tightened on her waist, his body trembling beneath her, and Charlotte couldn't stop herself from pressing closer, her hips rocking against his in a slow, sensual rhythm. "Aunt Charlotte, please," he groaned, his voice desperate. But whether he was begging her to stop or keep going, she didn't know. All she knew was that she couldn't stop now. Not when he felt wonderful beneath her. Not when she could feel the way his body responded to her slowly. Charlotte kissed her way back up to his mouth, her hands sliding over his chest as she kissed him deeply and passionately. Zachary moaned into her mouth, his hands roaming over her body, and Charlotte shivered as his touch sent shivers down her spine. This was wrong, so very, very wrong, but in that moment she didn't care. All that mattered was the way he made her feel. Charlotte's heart hammered wildly in her chest as she felt Zachary's lips part beneath hers, his resistance fading completely. His hands roamed over her back, slipping under her shirt and grazing her skin, the sensation making her gasp softly into his mouth. She kissed him deeper, her tongue sliding against his as she pressed her body closer to his, feeling the heat of him through the thin fabric of his clothes. She could sense his hesitation, the way his fingers trembled slightly as they explored her curves. But every time he tried to pull away, even for a second, Charlotte captured his mouth again, kissing him harder and deeper until he was left breathless and trembling beneath her. The taste of him was entirely intoxicating, driving her wild with need, and she couldn't stop her hands from wandering. She couldn't resist sliding her fingers down to the hem of his shirt and pushing it up, exposing the smooth skin of his abdomen. "Zachary," she murmured against his lips, her voice low and husky. "I've wanted this for so long," he shuddered, his breath coming out in a ragged gasp as Leo leaned down, her lips trailing along his neck. She felt his pulse racing beneath her mouth, and felt the way his body tensed as her hands moved over him, caressing every inch of bare skin she could reach. He was so warm, so strong, and the feel of him, the taste of him, made her head spin. "Aunt," he whispered, his voice strained, "Charlotte, we can't." But the way his hands tightened on her waist and his body arched up against hers conveyed a different story. He didn't want her to stop, not really. "Don't fight it," she whispered back, her lips brushing against his ear. "Just let yourself feel," and then she kissed him again, her hands sliding up his chest, pushing his shirt higher until he lifted his arms and let her pull it off completely. Charlotte tossed it aside, her eyes darkening as she took in the sight of him. His broad shoulders, the defined muscles of his chest and stomach, the way his skin glistened faintly in the moonlight. Zachary groaned, his hands tangling in her hair as she kissed him, his body trembling beneath her touch. Charlotte smiled against his skin, her tongue flicking out to trace the lines of his muscles, savoring the way he shivered in response. She kissed lower down to his stomach, her hands sliding over his sides, feeling the way his muscles tensed beneath her fingers. "Can't, Charlotte. Please," he murmured, his voice a breathless plea. But Charlotte didn't stop. She kissed her way back up, her hands roaming over his chest and his shoulders, then sliding down to his hips as she straddled him, her body pressing against his in a way that made both of them gasp. "Does this feel wrong?" she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. She rocked her hips against him, the slow, sensual movement making him groan softly. "Yes," I mean, no, I don't know, he stammered, his hands gripping her waist as if he didn't know whether to pull her closer or push her away. Just let go, Zachary, Charlotte murmured, her voice soft and seductive. She leaned down, her lips capturing his in a deep, lingering kiss, her hands sliding up to cup his face as she kissed him again and again, each kiss more passionate, more desperate than the last. Zachary's resolve crumbled completely. He kissed her back with a hunger that matched her own, his hands sliding up her back, pulling her closer as he rolled them over, pinning her beneath him. Charlotte asked softly, her heart racing as he looked down at her, his eyes dark and filled with a desire she'd never seen before in Aunt Charlotte. He murmured, his voice low and raw, "I can't stop." She whispered back, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair, Don't stop." And then he was kissing her again. As his hands moved over her body, touching and exploring as if he couldn't get enough of her, his mouth was hot and demanding against hers. Charlotte arched beneath him, her body trembling as his hands slid down to her thighs, pushing up her skirt, his fingers brushing lightly over her bare skin. Zachary gasped softly, her hands gripping his shoulders as he kissed his way down her neck, his lips trailing over her collarbone, then lower, the feel of his mouth on her skin. The heat of his body pressed against hers was almost too much to bear. Every touch, every kiss sent jolts of electricity through her, spinning her head. "I want you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her hand sliding down his back, pulling him closer and closer. "I want you so much." Zachary groaned, his hands tightening on her thighs as he kissed her again. His mouth hot and insistent against hers, Charlotte could feel the tension between them building. She could feel the way his body responded to hers, and it only made her want him more. She slid her hands down to the waistband of his pants, her fingers trembling slightly as she began to unbutton them, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. "Zachary," she whispered again, her voice a low, breathless murmur. "Please." He looked down at her, his eyes dark and intense, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then slowly he leaned down, his lips brushing lightly against hers in a kiss so soft, so tender, it made her heart ache. "I want you to," he whispered back, his voice low and strained, and then he kissed her again. His hands glided over her body, touching and caressing her as if he was insatiable with her. Charlotte's breath hitched as his hands moved lower, his touch sending shivers down her spine. She arched against him, her body trembling with anticipation, and when his fingers finally brushed against her most sensitive spot, she gasped, her hands gripping his shoulders, as a wave of pleasure washed over her. "Zachary," she moaned softly, her voice a desperate plea, and then everything else faded away. The world, the consequences, everything but the feel of him, the way he touched her, the way he made her feel in that moment. Nothing else mattered. All that mattered was him and her, tangled together in a forbidden embrace, their bodies moving in perfect sync as they gave in to the desire that had been building between them for so long.